may have to stand with your toes on the white tape if possible.
If you had to pin a label to Tony Blair's politics, what do you think it would be?
Right, my name's Tony Blair. I'll be speaking around about this level.
It's very difficult to pin down or label ideologically what Tony Blair was.
Shall I say he was a radical Labour leader?
Can you turn that monitor off when we get to...
Well, I think that's what Tony Blair to describe. I mean, I worked with him. It was constructive for most of the time. But he can explain for himself where he came from. I just know where I came from.
Thank you. Thank you.
I suppose, you know, I've always considered myself as on the progressive side of politics. So for me, you know, the idea that the problems of Britain were going to be solved by nationalisation, by more trade union power, by leaving public services as they were, this was just a return to the past.
We know we've got far, far more to do. We've only laid the foundations.
It became much more than about, you know, a traditional type of Labour politics. Nonetheless, I could see that after those first couple of years, I was increasingly becoming a sort of radical within my own government. This really then became a disagreement within the family, if you like, and within the leadership, and within the two most important people in the leadership.
Gordon Brown has ruled himself out of the contest.
Tony Blair is elected Leader of Labour.
Mr Brown, having wanted to step in for so long, now gets the opportunity.
Welcome to the Millennium Dome, the focus of national celebrations. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh are here, the Prime Minister and his family are here, and so are 10,000 people roughly
to ring out the old millennium and bring in the new.
Today, at the frontier of the new millennium, I set out for you how, as a nation, we renew British strength and confidence for the 21st century. Well, in 2.5 years of office, we are laying the foundations of a new and a better Britain. But I acknowledge immediately there is much still to do.
So a couple of years in, I felt a contradictory sentiment. I felt at one and the same time that I was much more capable of governing. I understood the system. But I also felt at the same time that we'd not been nearly radical enough.
In central London, Tony Blair went on a New Year's Day walkabout to wish members of the public a happy new year.
At that time, people liked what they heard about New Labour. They liked the fact that the economy was growing, but they didn't see any change on the ground. The NHS wasn't improving, waiting times were still too long, crime was rising, the trains were in a chaos.
We'd set a lot in train, and we needed to ensure we delivered it. And delivery is the best way of winning people over.
The Millennium Dome at Greenwich, modern, trendy and media-friendly, has become a symbol of New Labour. But the Dome's been criticised too for lacking substance and delivering less than its creators had promised.
People were getting impatient, and rightly they were getting impatient. Tony totally understood that.
I know why people elect me. I know they want results very quickly. I know there's a sense of impatience out there, but I've got to do it stage by stage, step by step. Yes, we'd made some big changes in the country, but that radical transformation of the public realm, I felt that was still to come.
Someone once said, Blair doesn't do boring. And if you really want to get things done, you have to be prepared to do the boring. Instead of doing that, he set up a delivery unit, and he set up a coordination unit, and he thought they would do the stuff for him. But it doesn't really work like that, in my opinion. You have to do it yourself.
I remember saying to him, I said more than once, there's a real danger. People looking at your first term will only remember the things which you were not interested in. Scottish devolution.
Majority in favour of devolution.
Welsh devolution.
Very narrow yes vote in the Wales referendum.
House of Lords reform.
Centuries of tradition should end tomorrow.
Hereditary peers will lose their rights to sit.
Freedom of information.
It gives people the right of access to thousands of documents held by government.
Human rights legislation.
Everyone in the United Kingdom will have new legal rights.
That is an amazing raft, but none of them things you put your political weight to. Oh, I wish you'd stop saying that, he said. What do you actually want to achieve, I'd say.
Tony never wanted to be a conventional tax and spend Labour Prime Minister. He always itched for something more.
Huge cheers, a standing ovation.
Tony wanted to create a different, changed, modern Britain.
A new Britain, a model 21st century nation, based not on privilege or class or background, but on the equal worth of all.
For me, the central guiding belief of New Labour was that if you wanted to create a more just society, it wasn't simply about transferring money from the more wealthy to the poorer parts of society. All of that has its place and is important, but if you wanted to transform people's lives, then it wasn't just about investment in public services, it was about deep structural reform.
A predecessor of mine famously said she wanted to be able to go into the hospital of her choice on the day I want, at the time I want, with the doctor I want. Remember that? Margaret Thatcher's argument for going private. I want to go to the hospital of my choice on the day I want, at the time I want, but I want it on the National Health Service.
Tony recognised that people wanted their kids to go to a good school, but they didn't want to be told necessarily, well, you've got no choice, it's the one at the end of the road.
Why do you want choice? People would say, we just want a good school. Why not just have a good school in each neighbourhood? And Blair's answer to that was, the wealthy have always had choice. This is about empowering people. It's about giving choice to everybody, regardless of their income. It wasn't traditional Labour territory, but that is classic Blair. It's New Labour.
Let us step up the pace now. Be confident as a political party. Be radical.
This really then became, for me, the defining mission of the New Labour government.
To set our people free.
In the public sector, it's clear that New Labour is different from old. Above all, this government is more concerned with those who use services rather than those who provide them.
Tony believed choice and reform within our public services was a route to excellence. And that was a path that many of us, but principally Gordon, were more sceptical about walking.
Gordon Brown, take one.
Gordon regarded Tony's public service reform agenda as an awful lot of floundering around. He felt that more books, more teachers, more equipment were what the schools needed. Hospitals, more doctors, more nurses, more operating theatres, better equipment. There was nothing in Gordon's view, really, that more and further investment couldn't tackle or solve.
Teddy was always wanted to be seen to stand slightly outside the Labour tradition. And Gordon didn't like divides within the core Labour family, so I think he just found that hard.
Tony Blair and I set out to make the Labour Party electable, to make it modern, to make it capable of reflecting its values and policies, but nobody disguised the fact that people come to politics with different perspectives, with different priorities, with different positions. Where there were difficulties, I'm honest about them, and they were honest policy disagreements.
He was more traditionally thinking about, you know, the basic Labour support. I mean, the reality is with me and Gordon, yes, I was always more on the aspirational, how do you make sure that that group of working class voters that deserted to Maggie Thatcher in the 80s came with Labour. Those were more, in a sense, my folk.
You know, Tony and Thatcher is an interesting relationship. He was always keen to analyse, you know, who she was, where she came from, what she was doing.
There were politicians who basically got one fundamental truth about the public. What unites the country, whether you're low income, middle income, or whatever, is this sort of notion that individual aspiration has to be realised and rewarded.
Our education system used to serve us well. A child from an ordinary family, as I was, could use it as a ladder, as an advancement.
Yeah, I admired Margaret Thatcher as a leader and as an agent of change. I just disagreed with her strongly over Europe and over the nature of society. But, you know, you could see that in the changes she made and in the way she governed. I mean, you know, again, if you want to be objective about it, she was a very strong and effective leader.
I always think Tony Blair saw himself as a bridge. Some leaders see themselves as a personal bridge that can connect things that can't normally be connected. And it's a great skill in a leader. You know, he could connect the conservative, the traditional conservative voter with the Labour Party.
Are you all right, mate? West, when you come stand by me, you get
He didn't want so much as to attack Mrs. Thatcher as to go beyond Mrs. Thatcher in creating a new and modern Britain.
Hi. Yeah, nice to see you.
Mrs. Thatcher knew that she was a remarkable figure, but she didn't dwell on it too much. There was a much bigger element of ego in Blair.
Mais c'est vrai, hein?
Je suis désolé.
Non, mais c'est vrai,
Vous
hein?
avez écrit con.
Blair was always exploring who he was, about how far he could push the boundaries of his own achievement. And I think that was privately, inwardly, the centre of his ambition.
That sounds like a very self...
Does that make sense? I'm
slightly self-obsessed.
What am I going to say about that? Yes. I think he was... Phew. I think he was the centre of his universe. Except that Gordon was always there, competing and pushing him out of territory and getting in the way.
That's it. Do it. Toast it. Toast, gentlemen.
It is coffee.
Well, I hope you guys do well. This is going to be difficult, isn't it?
It looks natural, inviting the neighbour in to watch the football, but they're together in the Chancellor's Downing Street flat at a time of reported tension between them.
Right throughout history, you've had Thatcher Lawson, you've had Major Lamont. Tensions and sometimes creative, sometimes not creative tensions are the stuff, I'm afraid, of politics.
Yet more rumours have emerged that Mr. Brown is widening his power base and may yet be after the top job.
The problem for the government was created by the original circumstances in which Gordon stepped aside, demanding a sort of a guarantee, you know, that he would have oversight of, you know, domestic, social and economic policy. You almost had an expectation that there would be a dual premiership operating in the government, that Gordon, in a sense, as Chancellor, would be sort of level pegging with Tony as Prime Minister. And that was never realistic, and I think it created a problem for both of them.
I see economic policy as economic and social policy because you're dealing with taxation and therefore you're dealing with issues of inequality and fairness. And therefore, to be fair, most of the decisions on economic and social policy then were made by me.
He has put in the largest increase in child benefit this country's ever seen. It's money that would never have gone in under the Conservative Party.
He did represent an important part of Labour's coalition. I think he played a big role in that, and I think you've got to, any fair assessment of the government recognises that, despite all the personal difficulties that there were, which were obviously at times very wary.
Gordon was ruthless, actually brilliant in the way that he quietly, without drama, got a large chunk of the government machine under his direct control. Government departments were split between Brownites and Blairites, and Brown supporters got favour in public spending and Blair supporters didn't.
He held the money, so those who hold the money have enormous power.
The Treasury and the spending departments, and particularly the health department, were in a continual battle.
Queuing for treatment and queuing for beds, the flu outbreak is stretching the NHS to the limit.
Reported cases have quadrupled in a month, putting the National Health Service under severe pressure.
People were dying on trolleys in A&E departments, waiting lists had counted out of control.
The government's critics say the flu outbreak is just an excuse. The real problem, they say, is a shortage of hospital beds and nurses.
How can it be that with the world's fifth biggest economy, something as predictable, as cyclical and as common as flu can cause the system to be breaking apart at the seams?
Tony could see the political need and the health service need to dramatically increase levels of resourcing and investment going into the system. But the way that the Treasury under Gordon worked was very closed, very tightly controlled, and remarkably uncollegiate.
When we had winter pressures, Tony would want to say, couldn't I announce a small pot of money to help with the winter now? And Gordon would say, actually, the way we're doing things is to do things in a more disciplined way through the spending review. And we shouldn't just come up with pots of money here, there, or everywhere.
We've simply been unable to shift Gordon on the money for the health service. But Tony was pretty forceful. He did insist on the things he wanted to insist on. And so eventually Tony just went on to the David Frost programme and announced there would be more money, we'd match the European average on health spending.
If we can carry on getting real-term rises in the health service of almost 5%, our health service spending comes up to the average of the European Union. It's too low at the moment.
And then very quickly, people worked out exactly what that meant in terms of numbers. And the numbers were really big.
That will mean increases starting at $2.5 billion a year and rising every year after that, more than has ever been achieved before.
I'm not sure that Tony discussed it in detail with Gordon before the Frost programme. And there may have been, you know, a little spark or two afterwards.
Of course, Gordon said, "You've stolen my fucking budget." And it was true.
He might well have said it, and actually, he might have had a point. I think the thing which threw us was we didn't make announcements about budgets and spending without both the Treasury and Lumberton knowing about it. It was definitely a message. I'm not sure that it was actually a message to Gordon, because, I mean, Gordon wanted to spend more money on health and education, as Tony did.
It's Gordon Brown's fourth budget. He's in the enviable position of delivering it in the midst of a healthy economic environment.
For the last 3 years, Gordon Brown has prided himself as being the Iron Chancellor who's kept his naturally generous heart under control.
Iron Chancellor was not my term, but it was probably a necessary term.
He was an Iron Chancellor, if you like, for a purpose. The purpose was to get through that first term of a Labour government, proving that we were able to be trusted so that we could then move to the next stage. All these things that had been dreams and aspirations, we were now in a position, an enviable position, that we could put in place.
Chancellor Gordon Brown's decided to use the surplus in the economy to increase public spending.
We had built up to 2000. We'd created stability, growth, and we'd actually reduced the debt very substantially.
There'll be an extra £2 billion next month for the NHS, an extra £1 billion now for education.
And so we thought we could say our emphasis is schools and hospitals first. In other words, we're going to invest in our public services.
It is a budget that unites the whole country. It is a budget for all the people. We have been prudent for a purpose, a stronger, fairer Britain, and I commend this budget to the House.
Gordon was determined to channel more money to those most in need. So he sought to increase child benefits, he sought to increase the state pension, and of course we introduced the national minimum wage. But the real policy innovation in the Treasury at that time was targeted support. So in the employment market, there was the working tax credit. In child benefit terms, there was the child tax credit. And for pensioners, there was the pensioner credit.
It is true that Labour is the party of social justice, but it's also true that we were modernising our approach to social justice. So tax credits was a completely different thing from sort of talking about social security handouts or something like that.
Tax credits was redistribution by stealth, in a sense, but it wasn't sort of blindingly obvious to people that that's what was going on.
2 million children out of poverty. We took 2 million, maybe 3 million pensioners out of poverty. I'm not sure that people understood how it had happened, but it did change our society.
We were the most redistributive government of any government since 1945. And we had charts in every budget document to show it. That was the first moment when I thought that we were succeeding.
So I think it is fair to say that if they deliver on this 4-year plan of health, that will be unprecedented.
It's absolutely clear that overwhelmingly Labour's policies most helped the poorest and they least helped the most well-off.
Targeted low-income families and wants to reduce child poverty.
Now, I think some of that was lost because, in a sense, Tony in particular didn't want to kind of talk about that. You know, in a way we redistributed quietly because that wasn't really part of the new Labour script.
New Labour basically reduced inequality between the middle and the bottom, but increasingly the very, very richest were earning more and more compared to the middle.
I think it's a fair criticism of those years that we didn't do enough to tackle inequality at the top.
Big cheer for him, though. Very big cheer for him.
Tony wanted to rule out forever a rise in the top rate of tax. I did not want to rule it out. I feel that should have been my decision as the Chancellor. Now, what we traded was short-term advantage because people thought, well, you know, Labour's just like the Tories in tax, no problem, for long-term gain, which was our ability to finance the public services and to do something more about tackling inequality.
You know, exactly 100 years ago, men and women of courage and belief came together to form the Labour Party that we know today. And these pioneers were idealists, but they were not dreamers. They knew how much easier it was to be conservative than to stand for change, easier to surrender to powerful interests than to stand up to them, easier to opt for the short term than take a long-term stand.
Tony was always wanting not just to be focusing on the things that Labour people always like focusing on, poverty, jobs, spending on health and education, always looking for that the next part of the agenda. But in saying that, I don't think anybody should run away with the idea that Gordon wasn't pushing hard as well. I think sometimes maybe the messaging from each of them was different.
Periods under fire did not water down their efforts or their belief, but strengthened them. Short-term setbacks did not diminish their zeal to win converts. It made them more determined to persuade people and win a mandate for change.
I've always thought there's something significant about the fact that Gordon's background involves preaching, and Tony was a barrister. Gordon is never happier than standing in front of an audience of true believers. Alleluia to the cause.
The opportunity to serve, that is all we ask.
Tony is never happier than speaking to a sceptical jury, trying to convince them of something which they're not entirely convinced of. Speaking to the middle ground, speaking to people who weren't traditional Labour supporters.
He was a slightly surprising Labour MP because of his background. His father, for example, had been quite an active Conservative. And so there was a bit of curiosity as to why he had ended up in the Labour Party.
Well, I remember having this conversation with Tony. I said, look, you're always doing the new bit of New Labour, but if you don't do any of the Labour bit and go back to Labour values, then people start thinking you're floating off from the Labour Party. And his answer was, which I thought was very revealing, was, well, if I'm not doing the new bit, I don't think anyone else is going to be. So he felt the onus was on him to push the new.
It was Wembley Arena, which is a massive complex, and there were 10,000 Women's Institute members. This is all of a piece with our Lion's Den strategy, that there was nowhere you were scared of going.
Well, that was... Have you talked to Angie Hunter? I hope did she confess that she thought it was a really good idea?
Good morning. We begin our meeting, as always, by singing Jerusalem.
I did think this isn't, there wasn't the sort of normal frisson of excitement that you get when the Prime Minister's arriving.
I've never known a speech that had as much internal angst and discussion as that one.
This is truthfully the most terrifying audience I've ever seen in my life.
And essentially what he was trying to do was do a big, forward-looking, political agenda type of speech.
Let me try and say what I mean by extending that opportunity. We need to help the 7 million people, 7 million adults, who have trouble with basic literacy in our country today.
Many of us thought, this is a really bad idea. And a smaller number, which included Tony, thought, this is exactly where we need to be.
The spirit of this age is different, it's democratic.
There was absolute deathly silence.
On the basis of doffing our cap or hierarchy.
And I just thought, it's not very good.
I've spent a long time trying to work very hard on the National Health Service. Thank you very much.
But he kept going, and people started slow hand clapping. I mean, it was just awful.
The crowd, they're applauding, but they're not applauding, they're going...
And people just started shouting, no!
Oh, right. The Women's Institute, well, that was an absolute classic.
To try and make sure.
Ministers speak out of politeness.
I was probably a bit disoriented because Leo had just been born and I had 2 weeks paternity leave. I kind of gave them a lecture. They gave me a raspberry.
Not us, definitely not him.
I just felt that he didn't respect us this morning by using our organisation as a platform.
I'm always trying to be, a little mischeerful. I said something stupid like, I thought it went down very well, apart from that little slow, that hand clapping at the end, that odd hand clapping. It was this long pause, and he just turned to me and he said, "Keep it plausible, darling."
Tony had cut short his speech. It was a complete disaster from start to finish. The press loved it as a symbol that we'd lost our touch with Middle England, that this was the quintessential Middle England audience, and we didn't know how to read it anymore.
Clearly there is a problem of connecting Labour's message with the people Labour needs to reach. And there's no disputing the fact now, I think, that the next election on current trends is going to be much more of a hard fight than most people expected not so long ago.
In a sense, it's sort of midterm blues. Most governments in midterm find that governing is hard and things mount up and it's not going exactly how you want it to.
A day of protest, a day of discontent. A quarter of Britain's petrol stations are running out of fuel.
The fuel crisis has crystallised a public mood. Mr. Blair, he's seen as arrogant and out of touch.
The thing you realise about government is you're not the person standing there with the placard, right? You're the person whose face is on the placard.
Mr. Blair was going through one of those phases where metal gets tested.
I found that difficult from time to time because I was thinking, look, we're doing quite a good job. We're trying to help everyone.
Downing Street dug in tonight in defence of the Dome and the Dome Minister. But the political storm over the seemingly constant drain on lottery millions took on totally new proportions.
You know, I was someone who liked to be popular, and when I came to power was popular.
Since Labour came to power, pensioners have taken to the streets to make the government listen. They're calling for the link to be restored between pensions and earnings.
But you have to believe this when I say I ultimately came to distrust the popularity as much as I came to recognise you had to live with the unpopularity. Because in the end, it's not what governing's about.
Good evening. Pensions, petrol, the Dome and the polls have all thrown their shadow over the opening day of Labour's conference at Brighton.
Tony Blair struggling to regain the initiative after the chaos of the fuel dispute.
He would always be anxious about the public mood. He pretended not to be massively concerned about it, but he was.
You had a 22-point lead in the polls just 2 or 3 weeks ago. Now it's 8 behind, which is an incredible swing.
The thing you have to remember about politicians, they can have massive, thick rhino skin. And Tony probably had a thicker skin than most. But they've also got deep insecurity. Because they're only there at the public say-so. And if they don't deliver, they'll be out on their ear.
He got anxious. He got anxious. Sometimes he had doubts about himself. But don't underestimate winning. The utter obsession that that's what it's about.
We know we're in a fight. And it's a fight I relish, for it is a fight for the future, the heart and the soul of our country.
Labour had never won 2 successive full elections. It never governed for more than 6 years. Unless you can govern for at least a decade, and preferably longer, you can't make transformative change.
A fight for a new vision for Britain in which the old conflict between prosperity and social justice is finally banished to the history books in which it belongs.
But I knew it could only be achieved by a Labour Party that was itself oriented towards the future and the way the world was changing. And that's always, by the way, when progressives win. They win when they own the future.
It is a fight worth fighting, and it is a fight we must win.
Another side of him, you could easily miss it in the easygoing nice guy. And he didn't use it all the time. But when he wanted to, and when he had to, he was utterly ruthless.
It was one of those out-of-the-blue moments.
Is your job safe, Mr. Mandelson?
And it was a small article in the Observer on a Sunday about Peter possibly having helped the Hindujas to get a passport.
Did Tony Blair's favourite minister help get a passport for an Indian tycoon who bankrolled the Dome?
Wealthy businessman and sponsor of the Millennium Dome, Srichand Hinduja. Peter Mandelson is once again under attack tonight over his recollection of events.
I did feel a sort of slight knotting in the pit of my stomach.
Once more, the government is surrounded by the whiff of sleaze.
I got a message from Number 10 saying, the Prime Minister would like you to look into this very quickly. And I had to report to Mr. Blair, there's not a shred of evidence that Peter Mandelson has done anything wrong.
Wednesday morning, and you can hear the media, you know, from when you walk in the gates at the bottom, and just literally shouting, you know, what's going to happen with Peter? What's going to happen with Peter?
We all gathered, along with Richard Wilson, the Cabinet Secretary, in Tony's flat and went through the whole thing.
You had all sorts of people there, Alistair Campbell on the windowsill, and Blair was standing up. It was a bad moment. He knocked over a cup of coffee into a very hairy rug, which didn't help.
I made the case for the defence. My view was we should appoint an inquiry into this, but we shouldn't sack Peter before the inquiry. We should have the inquiry first and then decide what to do. But Alistair, Tony and the others felt that the story had just got so out of hand that they had to get rid of Peter.
Tony said, Peter's going. And I can remember just thinking, oh my God. And I remember saying, are you sure?
It was my clear view that Peter had not done anything wrong. But Blair was convinced he had to go. And the inner group, the court suddenly vanished from the room because Peter Mandelson was coming to see the Prime Minister.
When I was seeing Tony, when he was forcing my resignation, Alistair Campbell entered the room, stood behind, sort of slightly sighing with impatience. You know, he had an 11 o'clock lobby briefing to go to, and he wanted my resignation by that time.
So it wasn't that I was sort of saying, I've got to go out and tell them what's going on. I've got to go out and give them a definitive answer as to what's going on. I went down and I told them accurately that Tony was up there and he was sorting it out. They kind of read from that curtains.
Journalists came out of their daily briefing with the news that Number 10 was refusing to say that Mr. Mandelson was safe in his job.
And he went out into the street, and I remember the wind was blowing. It's awful, I'll never forget it.
I'd like to make a brief statement, if I may. I am today resigning from the government. I want to remove myself from the countless stories of controversy, of feuds, of divisions, and all the rest, all the other stories that have surrounded me. I want, in other words, to lead a more normal life.
Now, I think maybe Peter thinks that that was me pushing him out. I wasn't.
Thank you very much indeed. Are you standing at the next election, Mr. Mandelson? Are you still...
I think Tony reached a judgment that this is just too messy and I'm going to bring it to an end.
This was one public execution where the executioner and the condemned sat together as friends.
The Right Honourable Gentleman has been central to everything the Prime Minister has done. It was the Right Honourable Gentleman who briefed the press for him. The Right Honourable Gentleman who stabbed the Chancellor in the back for him. The Right Honourable Gentleman who spun all of his campaigns for him.
You have to understand the context. This was in the immediate months leading up to his first re-election, and he was desperate to win that second term. And nothing was going to stand in the way, not even the facts.
I think he has made an enormous contribution, and I also believe that he is a bigger man than many of his critics.
Look, in the end, you know, your job as the captain of the ship is to keep it steady.
Mr. Mandelson, how do you plan to clear your name?
Peter won't enjoy necessarily hearing this, but I think it is fair to say that had it been somebody else, maybe it wouldn't have happened. But Peter is Peter.
I probably, or almost certainly, made more enemies than I needed to or than I deserved. But I always felt I was doing it not for myself, but for the Labour Party. No doubt there were things I would have done differently, but actually, all told, no. I did what I needed to do for my party, and it was right.
I don't know if Peter remember this, there's a line in my diaries from a previous situation where he said, Peter actually said, you know, what I love about Tony is his utter ruthlessness and his selfishness. and he could be ruthless, and he had to be at times.
It was, in retrospect, it was a mistake to ask Peter to leave. We lost a lot when we lost him from government, but I like to think the person I am today would have said, no, we're going to tough this out.
Just over 4 years after his election landslide, Tony Blair has named the day when he'll try to do it again and become the first Labour leader to win a second consecutive full term.
The preparation for this election wasn't quite in the same league as the 97 one. But nevertheless, it was the excellent Labour Party electoral machine cranking up again. You could hear it humming.
4 years has given us the chance to build foundations, but the work now has to go on.
I just loved being part of a Labour Party and a Labour project with Tony and Gordon and John Prescott at the head of it, who were absolutely obsessed and fixated with the idea that winning once is not enough.
John Prescott got off his battle bus in Cornwall and he was at it too.
John Prescott was important for New Labour. He was a working class boy made good, strong links with the trade unions. It was an important part of connecting this modernising drive in the Labour Party that could become a little messianic and sometimes a little detached from Labour's traditions.
Economic prosperity and social justice are two sides of the same coin.
John Prescott was sort of yin and yang a bit with Tony. They were very, very different people, but they had a huge mutual respect.
Traditional values in a modern setting, just a good expression of what New Labour was about, was his phrase.
2001. It was a pretty dull election. It really was. But John livened it up a lot. Tony was about to do question time, and my phone goes, and it's JP, and he says, "I've just thumped a bloke." I said, "What?" "I've just thumped a bloke. It's going to be on the telly."
John Prescott is attacked tonight before a Labour rally in North Wales. The Deputy Prime Minister exchanges blows. A man is arrested.
I don't know if Tony remembers this. When we were in the car going back to London, and I'm telling him what's happened, and he's going, "Oh, you can't thump people." "What do you mean he's thumped them? You can't thump somebody." And he said, "Well, I mean, what are we going to have to sack him?" The driver and the special branch guy simultaneously both looked around and said, "You what?" That was public opinion saying, "Listen, I don't care who he is. If somebody smacks him in the face, he's perfectly entitled to smack them back."
Okay, fire away. I arrived in Rhyl this evening for the meeting. I got off my bus into clearly a hostile crowd. I walked through all the jostling, and I was attacked by an individual.
It was a bizarre thing to end up with the Deputy Prime Minister decking one of the electors.
I mean, I'm me and John's John, so, and we're different people. And I tell you, you know, over the last 7 years, you get to know someone pretty well when they're as close to you as he has been to me as my deputy. And he has got very, very great strengths. Not least in his left arm.
There was no way of dealing with it in the end, other than what ultimately was both a completely enigmatic and meaningless, but also extremely accurate phrase, which is John as John.
Tony and Gordon, when their spat would sort of become a little bit, you know, more serious. John was always in there, always trying to help out, sort it out, really good mediator.
Some days it was hard going. We couldn't quite get Tony and Gordon on the same page. It just felt a lot of the time it was harder work than it should have been to get agreement about fairly simple things.
You were described in The Sun last week as the Lennon and McCartney of British politics, and it would be surprising if there wasn't some creative tension between any two people at the top of government.
Well, you know.
Should we write a song about
who
it,
wrote
maybe?
the songs?
Who is Lennon? Who's Lennon? Who's McCartney?
I think we work pretty well together.
Yeah, thank you. We'll put it to music for you.
When it was good, it was great. When Tony and Gordon were on song, we were unbeatable. It kind of felt like we were Barcelona playing against Hartlepool. That's how it felt. When it wasn't like that, a difference of opinion, or it was something more personal going on, then it became, yeah, utterly balls aching and took up way too much of our time and energy.
Before we reached the 2001 general election, I think it was becoming increasingly clear that both Gordon and Tony had different visions of New Labour in their minds.
Tony Blair set out his vision for a second Labour term in office today when he launched the party's election manifesto.
We were all waiting for Tony to come on the stage. And he was late, and we all looked at our watches and wondered what was going on, and Alistair Campbell came running over and said he wants to see you. So I had to go and see Tony in the green room waiting for him to go on stage. And what was happening was it wasn't Tony, it was Tony and Gordon, and they were having an almighty row. The row was about the role of the private sector in the NHS. And Tony was arguing that it was necessary, and Gordon was arguing that politically we shouldn't do that. For Gordon, it just felt like an un-Labour thing to do.
The original proposal was to allow these hospitals to do private operations and to charge people for operations. To some extent, they were to be outside the NHS. It just didn't seem to me to add up. And so I opposed these changes.
Where we are setting up new hospital units that can do the non-emergency operations, whether the management of those are in the public or private sector should be an open question.
I was determined that this should be a radical document. I was going to signal we were on a new stage of transformation. I think Gordon felt that it was too provocative in terms of what it was saying around the role of the private sector and markets.
Okay, thank you very, very much indeed, all of you.
I think Gordon, who was a great supporter of the early stage of modernisation, after the initial stages of reforms in the Labour government, I think he became more and more reticent and resistant to the reform programme in the public services.
You know, I would have preferred Gordon to be wholeheartedly for these things and with me all the way. The disagreement was clear, and it was at a certain level profound.
And of course it was portrayed as ambition on someone's part to stop someone else doing something, but that wasn't the point. This was a policy difference. These were genuine policy differences.
And that obviously became a continuing debate between us over the years, but in the end, that's politics.
Our exit poll says another Labour landslide.
Tony Blair has won that second full term for Labour that was always his ambition.
The first leader in the Labour Party's 100 years to lead them to a second full term. ...2001 will be remembered as Tony Blair's second landslide.
It's a pretty devastating rout for the Tory party.
We will be back. We will return.
Peter Mandelson still seemed to have a few demons to slay.
I am a fighter and not a quitter.
But as Tony Blair flew back to London to commence his second term, there was plenty to cause the Prime Minister pause for thought.
Tony was always weighing up whether the immense capacity, capability, sort of brilliance of Gordon was at times outweighed by the sort of friction and the difficulties of working together. You then thought, well, do I need all of this?
There was some talk after the 2001 election that perhaps the government would be better off if Gordon was in a different post, that he would be better off moving from the Treasury to the Foreign Office, and Tony did consider this.
Mr. Blair has got a rare chance now to shape the future in his image.
I was present at those discussions. Well, others were urging on him that Gordon, the time had come to move Gordon. Nothing could be worse than having Gordon at the Treasury in this very powerful position within government, blocking them and making life difficult.
I thought that Tony would move Gordon. I actually thought it would be quite good for Gordon, personally, because I actually thought, I don't expect Gordon to thank me for saying so, but I actually could see that if he did something like Foreign Secretary, I genuinely thought this would be Gordon at his best in the future.
Thanks very much.
I can remember the Prime Minister saying to me, so where can we move Gordon? And I said, Foreign Office. No, he said, the Prime Minister, he won't enjoy the Foreign Office. I certainly won't enjoy him there.
He felt that if Gordon was moved, he'd move out of the government altogether rather than accept being reshuffled, and he thought that would create a huge fissure in the party and the government.
So my view is that despite the difficulties, Gordon was a huge force. He was immensely capable. Therefore, if I were to move him, it would be for political reasons, because maybe I felt the relationship between us was becoming too difficult. But if I was going to be objective about it and say, well, what was in the interest of the government and its stability, it was to keep him.
We are going to take more of your comments.
I'm not saying I didn't think about it. I did think about it, but having thought about it, I believed that on balance it was best to keep him there.
Are you doing it all together today, or are you sort of going your separate ways after this?
I think he's doing Prime Minister's questions on his own.
Oh, right. He's still the Prime Minister. You're not the Prime Minister yet, then. I get it.
I did the questions yesterday.
Tony Blair, despite being very good at many, many things, was terrible at reshuffles. He didn't like doing them because he didn't like confrontation. And his strategy in politics was to hoover up somebody else's position and to empathize with somebody else, not to confront them.
I lived the TBGBs, as they've been called, for many years. And broadly, I would suggest that those tensions were incredibly constructive up until at least 2001. And they curdled and became destructive after 2001.
Look, they were political giants, and sometimes they had difficulty occupying the same space. And when those difficulties arose, the reverberations were incredibly loud.
My feeling about the split between Gordon and Tony was that it was tragic and was a tragedy. If I had to identify one human element of that, it would be inordinate ambition. It's a story as old as the hills. The prince couldn't wait for the king to die. It's the essence of quite a few Shakespearean tragedies.
Is there any other job in the cabinet you'd like to do apart from being Chancellor?
I'm not going to be drawn into that. I'm happy doing the job that I'm doing. It gives me a great deal of satisfaction to see. Look, I was in politics not for what position I held, but for what I could actually do. And I wasn't really obsessed with any particular title or anything else. I just wanted to get things done.
Would you like to be...
Tackling unemployment's been the big issue.
Would you like to be Prime Minister?
Kirsty, this is an amazing interview because you keep coming back to personalities.
I always used to say to my people, it's not an ignoble ambition for Gordon to want to be Prime Minister. Why shouldn't he want to be? He probably thinks he'll do a better job. Well, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We've just got to make sure that it doesn't disrupt us in the meantime. And I'm going to have to manage that as best I can.
Tony would say, look, I've told him, he can and should take over from me. But in the meantime, he's got to support me and help me deliver the policies I believe in, which he's not doing.
There was a peculiarity to the melodrama of Tony and Gordon's relationship. I suspect that Tony never really stopped feeling slightly guilty. And somehow this notion that Gordon had given it to him, or that Tony had taken it from Gordon, it never quite went.
Was there a kind of emotional block or a sense of some obligation you had to him that was an issue in your relationship?
Yes, of course. I mean, I had a... Gordon and I were as close as two people could ever be in politics. And I had a deep respect for him and affection for him that no amount of squabbling could ever erase, by the way. So, yes, of course, I felt an obligation to him. And I felt also a deep attachment to him, even when we were having difficult times.
Friendship in politics is very important because you need to be able to work together, but it doesn't always work out because everybody has different priorities and they have different preferences.
It was a very unusual political relationship, probably as a result of having been too close. Maybe two people can never be that close in politics.
Tony Blair's biggest weakness was he was a bridge, but that meant that in the end he was trying to please everybody. And then you get more and more people saying, well, what is the actual substance to this then? There was one stage about 3 years into the Labour government when I said New Labour would go through 4 stages: fascination, admiration, disillusionment, and contempt. And of course, I was hoping, as leader of the opposition, that we'd run quite quickly through those 4 stages. Well, those 4 stages did happen, in my view, but they happened over a much longer time frame.
When those terrorists drove the planes into those buildings, the world changed on its axis at that moment. The decision to go to war in Iraq was the hardest, most agonizing decision I took in my 10 years as British Prime Minister. No, I think about the decision and its consequences virtually every day. But the questions of legacy is not going to be determined by me, it's going to be determined by history.